The rain fell steadily outside the window of Martin Franklin's law office, droplets racing down the glass in erratic patterns that matched my scattered thoughts. The leather chair beneath me creaked as I shifted, a sound that seemed too loud in the weighted silence that had descended upon the room. My name is Daniel Hayes, 30 years old, and until 2 weeks ago I had a grandfather who loved me. Now I had only memories and the uncomfortable awareness of my brother's leg bouncing impatiently beside me. Martin Franklin's office hadn't changed in the 20 years I'd been coming here with Grandpa. The same mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that gave the space a dignified gravitas. The same green desk lamp cast a warm glow across the attorney's papers. Even the subtle scent remained consistent. Old books, lemon polish, and the faint trace of pipe tobacco that clung to Mr. Franklin's tweed jacket, despite the fact that he'd quit smoking years ago. "I appreciate you both coming in today," Mr. Franklin said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he spread several documents before him. Samuel was adamant about having the will reading conducted properly, in person. That sounded like Grandpa, formal, proper, a man who believed in doing things the right way. My eyes drifted to the photograph on Franklin's credenza, a younger version of the attorney standing alongside my grandfather at some charity event, both men smiling broadly. They'd been friends since law school, a relationship that spanned nearly 50 years. "Let's just get on with it," Evan said beside me, his impatience barely concealed beneath a veneer of grief. My brother, tall, broad-shouldered, with our father's strong jaw and our grandfather's steely blue eyes, looked every bit the Hayes heir in his tailored charcoal suit. Next to him, in my off-the-rack navy blazer and khakis, I felt like what I'd always been in the family photos, the addition, the afterthought, the one who didn't quite match. Evan's leg continued its nervous rhythm, the only outward sign of any emotion beyond the controlled mask of somber respect he'd worn since the funeral. I knew that face well. It was the same one he used in business meetings, the expression that had helped him climb to CEO of Hayes Construction by 28. Measured, calculated, revealing nothing. Mr. Franklin cleared his throat and lifted the envelope bearing Grandpa's last wishes. "This is the last will and testament of Samuel James Hayes, revised and notarized 6 months ago." He carefully broke the seal and removed several pages, the sound of rustling paper unnaturally loud. I stared at my hands, suddenly recalling Grandpa's fingers guiding mine as he taught me to sketch when I was 7, his patient voice explaining perspective and proportion while Evan practiced football in the yard. "You've got an artist's eye, Danny," he'd said, smiling when I captured the curve of the oak tree outside his window. "Different from the rest of us Hayes men, but special in its own right. Different." The word that had defined my existence in the Hayes household since I was 4 years old, when my parents, my adoptive parents, died in the car accident that Evan survived with only a broken arm. 2 boys suddenly orphaned, taken in by a grandfather who'd already raised his family. Evan, the biological grandson carrying the Hayes features and temperament, and me, the adopted one, with my darker coloring and quieter nature, a child who preferred sketchbooks to sports and who never quite fit the Hayes mold. Yet Grandpa had never made me feel less for those differences. "Family isn't about looking alike," he'd told me once. "It's about seeing the world through the same window." During the last years of his life, as his health declined, it was that window I'd tried to maintain for him, driving him to appointments, reading aloud from his favorite books when his eyesight began to fail, sketching scenes from the garden so he could still see the changing seasons. Mr. Franklin began reading the formal legal preamble, and I glanced sidelong at Evan. A slight smirk played at the corner of his mouth, the expression of someone who already knows the outcome, who has never questioned his place or his entitlement. Grandpa's company, the family home in Chestnut Hill, the summer place on Lake Champlain, Evan had spoken of these assets as inevitabilities for as long as I could remember. "When I take over," had been the preface to countless statements over the years. "To my 2 grandsons, who taught me what family truly means," Franklin read, his voice steady and clear. Evan straightened almost imperceptibly, the smirk becoming more pronounced. I braced myself for what I'd always expected, a token bequest to me, perhaps Grandpa's art collection or a modest trust, with the bulk of the estate going to the grandson who shared his blood and had followed him into the family business. "I leave my estate to be divided equally between them, share and share alike, with no distinction or preference." The words seemed to hang in the air, their significance slowly penetrating the room's hushed atmosphere. Beside me, Evan went completely still, the nervous bouncing of his legs suddenly arrested. I felt a curious lightness in my chest, not triumph or vindication, but something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement. Mr. Franklin continued reading, detailing how the division would work. The company shares split evenly, joint ownership of the properties, equal division of financial assets. With each specification, the temperature in the room seemed to drop a degree, the silence growing more pointed. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind raced. Equal shares. After years of Evan's casual assertions about when he inherited, after subtle reminders that I wasn't really a Hayes, Grandpa had made his final statement on the matter. In his eyes, we had been equals, both his grandsons, both his family. When Franklin finished reading, he looked up over his glasses. There are some additional documents regarding the business transition that we'll need to review, but that covers the essential distribution of assets. Do either of you have questions at this time? Evan's face had transformed, the smirk replaced by something harder, a tightness around his eyes that I recognized from childhood confrontations, the look that preceded explosion. "This can't be right," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the obvious tension in his jaw. "Grandpa always intended for me to take over the business entirely. We discussed it for years." Franklin's expression remained professionally neutral. "Samuel was quite explicit in his instructions, Evan. He revised this will multiple times over the past few years, and each version maintained this equal division. But I'm the one who's been working at Hayes Construction since college," Evan pressed. "Daniel hasn't spent a single day in the business. He doesn't know the first thing about construction or real estate development." "Your grandfather was well aware of your respective roles," Franklin replied evenly. "He felt confident in the provisions he established." I remained silent, watching this exchange with a curious detachment. Evan's reaction didn't surprise me. What surprised me was the absence of surprise I felt at Grandpa's decision. Somewhere deep down, I had known that the man who taught me that family was about choice, not chance, would make this choice in the end. Evan didn't argue further, not in that moment, not with a witness present. But as we left Franklin's office, stepping out into the rain that continued to fall in gentle persistence, I caught his expression and knew this was only the beginning. The storm in his eyes promised more than disagreement. It promised battle. "He didn't mean it," Evan said as we reached the parking lot, his voice barely audible above the patter of raindrops. "You have to know that, Danny. This isn't what he really wanted." I thought of Grandpa's hands guiding mine over sketch paper, of evenings reading Dickens aloud while he closed his eyes to listen, of conversations that stretched long into the night during his final months. "I think," I said quietly, "that Grandpa knew exactly what he wanted, and exactly who we are." Evan's face hardened into something I barely recognized. My brother, yet not my brother. A stranger wearing familiar features. "We'll see about that," he replied, and walked away toward his car, leaving me standing in the rain, equal heir to a legacy I had never expected, and which, I suddenly understood with absolute clarity, I would have to defend. The Hayes family home in Chestnut Hill stood as it always had, stately and dignified against the backdrop of maple trees that were just beginning to turn with the first hints of autumn. 3 generations had lived under its roof, their history embedded in the worn spots on the oak banister, the slight tilt of the 3rd step, the weathered porch swing where Grandpa and I had spent countless evenings watching the world go by. After the reading of the will, I found myself drawn back to these familiar spaces, seeking connection to the man who had raised me. I stood in Grandpa's study, running my fingers along the leather-bound books lining the shelves. The room smelled of him still, cedar, coffee, and the faint hint of the peppermint candies he always kept in his desk drawer. His presence lingered in the worn leather chair behind the desk, in the reading glasses still folded neatly beside the biography he'd been halfway through when his heart finally gave out. 2 weeks had passed since we'd gathered in Franklin's office. 2 weeks of weighted silence between Evan and me, of funeral arrangements and condolence calls, of sorting through the practical aftermath of a life ended. Grandpa's accountant had sent over preliminary documents regarding the estate, inventories of assets, property valuations, business holdings. I'd reviewed them carefully, not out of greed, but from a desire to understand exactly what Grandpa had entrusted to us, to me. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, an innocuous white envelope bearing the letterhead of James Winthrop, CPA, Grandpa's accountant for the past decade. Inside was a notice about adjustments to certain estate assets. According to the document, Several investment accounts previously listed in the estate inventory had been transferred to Evan's personal holdings 6 months prior. The adjustments reduced my inheritance by nearly $250,000. I frowned, puzzled rather than alarmed. Surely this was a clerical error. Grandpa had been meticulous about his finances, and such a significant transfer would have required documentation I'd never seen mentioned. I called Winthrop's office immediately, but was told he was unavailable. His assistant promised he would return my call the following day. He never did. Instead, 3 days later, another letter arrived, this one detailing substantial loans Grandpa had supposedly made to me over the years, now due to be repaid to the estate. The amounts were staggering, dates corresponding to periods when I'd been with Grandpa almost daily, helping manage his care. Loans I knew with absolute certainty had never existed. The third letter came a week after the will reading, claiming that Hayes Construction had outstanding debts that would require liquidation of certain assets before any distribution could occur. Assets that, coincidentally, included the Lake Champlain property I'd loved since childhood, the place where I'd learned to swim, where Grandpa had taught me to fish, where I'd produced my first portfolio of landscape paintings that eventually earned me a scholarship to art school. Each document bore Winthrop's signature, alongside official-looking stamps and notarizations. Each represented another piece of my inheritance quietly slipping away, and each felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate, the timing too convenient, the circumstances too perfectly aligned with what I knew Evan would want. I drove to Winthrop's office unannounced, only to be told he was on vacation. His assistant, new I noticed, not the same woman who had worked with him during Grandpa's lifetime, smiled blandly and offered to make a note of my concerns. When I asked for copies of the original transfer documents, she informed me that client files were confidential and could only be released with proper authorization. It was then that the pattern became clear. This wasn't error or coincidence. This was strategy. I called Mr. Franklin that evening, explaining the situation in careful, measured terms. His silence as I spoke was telling. Not surprise, but confirmation of something he might have expected. "Daniel," he said finally, "perhaps you should come by the office tomorrow. There are some matters regarding your grandfather's estate that we should discuss in person." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat instead on the porch swing, watching the moon rise over the trees that had witnessed my entire life with the Hayes family. The creaking of the chains as I swayed gently back and forth provided a rhythm for my thoughts, not frantic or panicked, but deliberate, piecing together what was happening with the careful attention Grandpa had always taught me to apply to my art. Observe, analyze, understand, only then decide how to respond. The next morning I found Evan in Grandpa's study, methodically going through the desk drawers. He looked up when I entered, not startled but irritated at the interruption. "I've been getting some interesting mail," I said without preamble, leaning against the doorframe. "Adjustments to the estate, loans I never took, debts that magically appeared." Evan straightened, closing the drawer he'd been examining. "The estate is more complicated than you understand, Danny. There are financial realities that need to be addressed. By erasing my inheritance, a flicker of something, not guilt exactly, but awareness, crossed his features before his expression settled into the controlled mask I knew so well. I'm simply ensuring that Grandpa's actual intentions are carried out. That document Franklin read wasn't what he really wanted. And you know that how? Because I know how the world works." Evan moved around the desk, standing to his full height, using the subtle advantage of his physical presence as he always had. Grandpa built Hayes Construction from nothing. He dedicated his life to creating a legacy that would last generations. You think he wanted half of that going to someone who doesn't even carry his blood? Someone who's never shown the slightest interest in the business? The words hung between us, their implication unmistakable. I'd heard variations of this sentiment throughout my life, whispered by extended family at holiday gatherings, implied in casual comparisons, hinted at whenever my choices diverged from the Hayes family expectations, but never had it been stated so baldly, so definitively. "You were never really his grandson, Danny," Evan continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sneer curling the edges of his mouth. "He only took you in because Mom begged him to before she died. This inheritance belongs to his blood." The statement should have wounded me. Perhaps years ago it would have, but as I stood there in the study where Grandpa had taught me to draw, where he'd helped me with homework, where he'd shared stories of his own father and grandfather, I felt only a profound certainty that Evan was wrong. "He told me once," I said quietly, that I wasn't his blood. I was his choice. The memory was clear. Grandpa sitting in this very room, his eyes kind but serious, as he addressed the insecurities of a 12-year-old who'd overheard comments at a family reunion. He said, choosing family was stronger than happening into it by accident. Evan's laugh was short and dismissive. Sentimental nonsense to make a kid feel better. Business and legacy are about bloodlines, Danny. Always have been. I studied my brother, this person I'd grown up with, shared a home with, who now seemed like a stranger wearing familiar features. His certainty was absolute, his worldview impenetrable. No argument I could make would reach him. You'll regret underestimating what he left me, I said finally, the words emerging not as threat, but simple statement of fact. Evan's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before the confident mask reasserted itself. What are you talking about? I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked out of the study, down the hall that held generations of Hayes family photographs, including mine, adopted but never treated as less by the man whose opinion actually mattered. What Evan didn't know, couldn't know, was that Grandpa and I had spent his final year working on something he'd never mentioned to the rest of the family. Our last project together, conducted during quiet evenings when his strength allowed, had nothing to do with art or literature. It had been about protection, about legacy in its truest sense. As I left the house, I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Franklin again. I'll be at your office in 20 minutes, I told him. I think it's time we discussed the second will. Martin Franklin's office felt different in the morning light. Sunbeams filtered through half-drawn blinds, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, giving the space an almost ethereal quality. The leather chairs creaked as I settled in, the same sound they'd made 2 weeks earlier when Evan and I had sat side by side, still united by grief if nothing else. Franklin entered from a side door, a heavy leather portfolio tucked under one arm. He looked older somehow, as if Grandpa's passing had affected him more deeply than professional composure had allowed him to show during the formal reading. "Daniel," he said warmly, extending his hand, "thank you for coming." His grip was firm, reassuring, the handshake of a man accustomed to providing stability during life's most turbulent moments. He settled behind his desk, placing the portfolio carefully before him. "I've been expecting your call," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Your grandfather anticipated this situation might arise." "The letters from Winthrop," I said. "The sudden debts, the transferred assets. None of it's legitimate, is it?" Franklin's expression tightened slightly. "James Winthrop was hired by Evan 6 months ago. Your grandfather's actual accountant, Bernard Michaels, retired last year. I had advised Samuel to inform you of the change, but—" He paused, shaking his head slightly. He insisted on handling matters his own way. A familiar sentiment. Grandpa had approached life with quiet determination, rarely explaining his methods until he was ready to reveal the completed picture. It was an approach I'd inherited from him, not through blood, but through years of careful observation. So the adjustments to the estate, fabricated, Franklin confirmed, his tone reflecting professional distaste. Winthrop is, I suspect, merely following directions. The signatures on those documents would not withstand scrutiny. I nodded, not surprised but still disheartened by the confirmation of Evan's betrayal. And Grandpa knew this might happen. Franklin's expression softened, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "Your grandfather was an exceptional judge of character, Daniel. He understood people's essential natures, their strengths and their limitations." He reached for the portfolio, opening it with deliberate care. From within, he extracted a sealed document, the envelope bearing Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, to be opened only in the event of contest. "Samuel came to me last April," Franklin explained, his fingers resting lightly on the envelope. "His health was declining, though he insisted on keeping the severity from both of you. We spent several weeks reviewing his estate, discussing scenarios, preparing for eventualities. I thought of those spring afternoons when Grandpa had seemed unusually tired, when our reading sessions had been shorter, when he'd asked me more frequently about my own future plans, my hopes beyond his lifetime. He had been preparing, in his way, for what he knew was coming. He asked me to hold this in my personal safe," Franklin continued, "separate from the formal will, a contingency, he called it. Insurance against human nature." He slid the envelope across the desk toward me. "Your grandfather anticipated this might happen." My name was written on the front in Grandpa's steady hand, not Daniel Hayes, but Danny, the name only he had ever used. I lifted the envelope, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. Inside was more than paper and ink. It was Grandpa's final protection, his last act of care. "Should I open it now?" I asked. Franklin nodded. "That would be appropriate." I broke the seal carefully, preserving the integrity of my grandfather's handwriting as much as possible. Inside was a document several pages long, the familiar letterhead of Franklin's law firm at the top of each page. But what caught my eye immediately was a handwritten letter paperclipped to the front. "My dear Danny, if you're reading this, then what I feared has come to pass. Evan has always struggled with the concept of sharing, a quality that serves him well in business, but poorly in family. I had hoped that my final wishes would be enough to ensure you received your rightful inheritance, but I've lived long enough to understand that hope must sometimes be reinforced with legal precaution. What follows is a secondary will, one that activates only under specific conditions. It contains a contest clause that I've asked Martin to explain to you in detail. In essence, if Evan challenges the equal distribution I've established, he triggers consequences that will, I believe, make him reconsider. This may seem harsh. Perhaps it is. But I've watched you both grow from boys to men. I've seen the choices you've made, the values you've embraced. You have chosen time and again to give rather than take, to support rather than demand. These qualities may not serve you in the ruthless world of business, but they reveal the true substance of a man's character. Know that this document represents not just legal protection, but my deepest confidence in you. You have never been less than in my eyes, Danny. Different, yes. Wonderfully, essentially different, but never less. All my love, Grandpa. I read the letter twice, my grandfather's voice clear in my mind as if he were speaking the words directly to me. The ache of missing him intensified, but alongside it grew a profound sense of being known, truly known and valued, by the man who had shaped my life. Franklin waited patiently as I set the letter aside and turned to the legal document. Its language was more formal but no less clear. A secondary will that would activate only if the equal distribution specified in the primary will was contested or circumvented. "The contest clause," Franklin explained, pointing to a section midway through the document. "It's quite straightforward. If either heir contests the equality of the inheritance or attempts to manipulate asset distribution through fraudulent means, all property, including the family home, business interests, and financial assets, shall revert solely to the non-contesting party." I stared at the words, their significance slowly penetrating my understanding. "If Evan challenges the will, he loses everything," Franklin nodded. "That is correct, and based on the communications you've received from Mr. Winthrop, we have clear evidence of attempt to defraud the estate. Should you choose to present this secondary will to the probate court, the entire inheritance would legally become yours alone." The magnitude of this revelation settled over me like a weight, not just the potential financial implications, but the profound understanding of what Grandpa had done. He had created not just protection, but a test of character, one that revealed the essential nature of his grandsons more clearly than any declaration could have. "This isn't what I want," I said quietly. Franklin's eyebrows rose slightly. "I beg your pardon? I don't want to take everything from Evan." I looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Grandpa intended for us to share the inheritance equally. That's what I want to honor." A small smile curved Franklin's lips. Approval, perhaps, or simple recognition. "That is, of course, your choice. But I should point out that your brother's actions have already demonstrated his unwillingness to honor Samuel's wishes. The fabricated debts, the asset transfers, these are just the beginning, Daniel. Without this protection, he will almost certainly succeed in minimizing your inheritance." I nodded, understanding the reality of what I faced. I'd like to give him one chance to reconsider, to honor Grandpa's wishes willingly. And if he refuses, then I'll present the secondary will. The decision crystallized as I spoke, certainty replacing doubt, not out of vengeance, but because Grandpa was right about us both, about who we are at our core. Franklin studied me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Samuel said you would respond this way," he said finally. "He told me, Danny will offer second chances even when they aren't deserved. He considered it your greatest strength, though he worried it might sometimes be a vulnerability." I thought of all the times Grandpa had watched me forgive Evan's smaller betrayals, the broken promises, the casual cruelties, the dismissals of my achievements. He had never criticized my tendency toward reconciliation, but now I understood he had been preparing for the possibility that one day forgiveness might not be enough. "Will you help me approach this correctly?" I asked. "Legally, I mean." Franklin nodded, reaching for a notepad. "We'll draft a formal response to Mr. Winthrop, requesting verification of all claimed transfers and debts. We'll copy the probate court and request a hearing. That should give your brother an opportunity to reconsider his course of action before the secondary will become necessary. As Franklin outlined the procedure, I gazed out the window at the maple trees lining the street outside, their leaves beginning to turn from green to gold and crimson. Grandpa had loved autumn. The transformation, he'd said, revealed the true colors that had been present all along, merely waiting for the right conditions to emerge. I thought of Evan's words in Grandpa's study. You were never really his grandson. How wrong he had been. The document before me proved that I had been chosen, deliberately and completely, by a man who understood family in its truest sense. What Evan had never grasped, what perhaps he could not grasp, was that legacy wasn't contained in bloodlines or business holdings. It lived in choices, in values transmitted not through DNA, but through daily acts of love and respect, through showing up when it mattered, through seeing people for who they truly were. As I signed the formal response Franklin had drafted, I felt a curious sense of peace. Whatever came next, whether Evan chose reconciliation or confrontation, I would face it knowing exactly who I was in Grandpa's eyes. Not the grandson he was given, but the grandson he had chosen. The Hayes construction offices occupied 3 floors of a downtown building that Grandpa had developed in the late 1980s. I hadn't visited in years, yet the receptionist recognized me immediately as I stepped off the elevator, her professional smile faltering slightly. "Mr. Hayes," she said, rising from her desk. "I didn't know you were coming in today." "I'm here to see my brother," I replied, noting the uncertainty in her expression, the silent question of which Mr. Hayes I represented in the company's new reality. "Of course. Let me see if he's available." Available was a formality, of course. Evan had been expecting me since Franklin's office had delivered our formal response to Winthrop 3 days ago. The cease and desist order, the request for verification of all claimed transfers, the notice of a scheduled probate court hearing. Each document had been carefully crafted to offer one clear message: the manipulation would not stand unchallenged. The conference room where Evan waited offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a vista Grandpa had been immensely proud of, a physical manifestation of how far he'd come from his humble beginnings. Evan stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the empire he'd believed would be exclusively his. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said without turning. "You knew I would." I settled into one of the leather chairs surrounding the polished conference table. The question was always, what would happen when I did? He turned then, his expression composed yet alert, the face of a man entering negotiations. "Your lawyer's paperwork was quite thorough, very dramatic. Not as dramatic as fabricating debts to cheat me out of my inheritance." A flicker of something, not quite shame, but perhaps discomfort, crossed his features before the mask reasserted itself. "Business requires creative solutions, Danny. You never understood that. Is that what you call fraud now, creative solutions?" Evan moved to the table, remaining standing as a subtle power play. "What do you want?" The directness of the question almost made me smile. Evan had always approached conflict as a transaction, identifying what the other party wanted, calculating the minimum concession necessary to achieve his goals. It was an effective strategy in business, less so in matters of family and principle. "I want what Grandpa intended," I said simply. "Equal shares, as his will specified. And the hearing next week? Depends on what happens here today." He studied me with newfound wariness. Perhaps recognizing that something had shifted in our usual dynamic. I had always been the conciliatory one, the peacemaker who yielded rather than prolonged conflict. But Grandpa's protection had given me not just legal standing, but a deeper confidence, the assurance that my place in the family was neither conditional nor secondary. "You've changed," Evan observed, dropping into the chair at the head of the table. "Not really. I've just stopped apologizing for who I am." For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of our shared history, both the connections and the divisions, filling the space between us. Outside the window, clouds moved across the autumn sky, casting shifting shadows over the city Grandpa had helped build. "The secondary will is quite comprehensive," I said finally. Franklin explained the contest clause to me. "If you persist in challenging the equal distribution, everything goes to me. The company, the properties, all of it." Evan's composure cracked visibly, disbelief replacing calculation. "That's impossible. Grandpa would never—" "He did." I met his gaze steadily. He knew exactly what might happen after he was gone. He prepared for it. "I don't believe you. The hearing is next Thursday. You're welcome to find out for yourself." The silence that followed held a different quality. Less standoff, more reckoning. Evan's certainties were crumbling, the narrative he'd constructed about his rightful place as sole heir dissolving before the reality of Grandpa's foresight. "Why are you here, Danny?" he asked eventually, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "If you have this leverage, why not just let the hearing happen? Take everything." It was a valid question, one that revealed more about Evan's worldview than perhaps he realized. In his understanding, power was something to be wielded against others, advantage something to be pressed to its fullest extent. "Because that's not what Grandpa wanted," I said. "He wanted us to share the legacy equally. The secondary will wasn't his first choice. It was his backup plan if you refused to honor his wishes. And you're giving me a chance to reconsider." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Withdraw the fraudulent claims. Return the transferred assets to the estate. Honor the equal division as Grandpa intended. If you do that, we move forward as equal partners in his legacy. And if I don't, then I present the secondary will at the hearing, and you lose everything." The starkness of the choice hung between us, unadorned by justifications or explanations. For perhaps the first time in our adult relationship, I wasn't seeking Evan's approval or understanding. I was simply presenting reality as it existed, a reality shaped not by me but by the grandfather who had raised us both, who had seen us with clear eyes. Evan rose abruptly, moving back to the window. His reflection in the glass showed an expression I rarely witnessed: uncertainty, perhaps even vulnerability. The careful mask momentarily discarded. "He always treated you differently," he said quietly. "I never understood why." The statement caught me off guard. Not accusation, but something closer to confession. Differently how? Patiently. Like he had all the time in the world for your questions, your art projects, your quiet conversations. Evan's voice held a note I couldn't immediately identify. Not quite resentment, but something adjacent to it. With me, it was always about achievement, results, continuing the Hayes legacy. I considered this perspective, so different from my own experience of growing up as the adopted grandson, always slightly outside the bloodline that Evan had taken such pride in. Maybe he gave us each what he thought we needed. Evan's laugh held little humor. What I needed was to know I mattered for more than what I could achieve. The revelation stunned me. This glimpse into my brother's inner landscape, so at odds with the confident exterior he presented to the world. For a moment, I saw him not as the antagonist of recent weeks, but as the boy he had once been, striving constantly to prove his worth through accomplishment, interpreting Grandpa's expectations as conditions rather than confidence. "He was proud of you," I said, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the thought. "He told me that many times. Proud of your drive, your business acumen. But he worried sometimes that you measured your value only in achievement." Evan remained silent, his back still turned, but the tension in his shoulders suggested my words had reached him. "The equal inheritance wasn't about diminishing your contribution," I continued carefully. "It was about affirming that family isn't measured in productivity or bloodlines. It's measured in love." Another long silence followed, broken only by the subtle sounds of the building, the distant hum of the HVAC system, the muffled ring of a phone several offices away. When Evan finally turned from the window, his expression had shifted into something more subdued, more genuine than I'd seen in years. "I need time to think," he said, "to consult with my attorneys." I nodded, rising from the chair. "The hearing is next Thursday. You have until then." As I moved toward the door, he called after me, "Danny?" I paused, looking back. "What will you do if you win? If you get everything?" The question seemed to hang in the air between us. A test of sorts. Though whether of my character or his understanding of it, I couldn't say. "Honor Grandpa's original wishes," I replied simply. "Offer you half." I left him standing in the conference room, silhouetted against the city skyline, a man confronting not just the potential loss of inheritance, but the unraveling of a narrative that had shaped his identity. Whether that confrontation would lead to transformation or entrenchment remained to be seen. The week that followed passed in strange suspension. I received no communications from Evan or his attorneys, no indication of what decision he might reach before the hearing. I spent the days at the family home, sorting through Grandpa's personal effects, his books, his correspondence, the artifacts of a life well lived. In each item, I found echoes of his wisdom, his quiet strength, his deliberate approach to family. In his desk drawer, I discovered a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before, a record of his thoughts dating back decades. The entries were sporadic but revealing, offering glimpses into his understanding of his grandsons. One passage from 15 years earlier caught my attention particularly. Watch Danny and Evan today at the lake. Such different boys, approaching the world through entirely different windows. Evan masters the external, the rules, the expectations, the paths to validation. Danny navigates the internal, the meanings, the connections, the spaces between what's said and what's meant. Each so gifted, each so limited by what they cannot see in the other's approach. My hope is that someday they'll recognize how much stronger they could be together than in opposition. The hearing arrived on a Thursday morning, clear and crisp, autumn fully established in the golden light that filtered through the courthouse windows. I arrived early, Franklin beside me, the secondary will secured in his briefcase. We waited in the designated courtroom, the minutes ticking by with no sign of Evan. He may have chosen not to appear, Franklin noted, checking his watch. That would effectively concede the case. I nodded, uncertain whether to hope for Evan's appearance or his absence. The former offered possibility for reconciliation, the latter a cleaner legal resolution. At precisely 5 minutes before the scheduled start, the courtroom doors opened. Evan entered alone, no attorneys, no assistants, just my brother in a charcoal suit that seemed to hang slightly looser on his frame than usual. He hesitated briefly, then crossed to where I sat. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside me. I nodded, watching as he settled himself, his movements careful, deliberate. For several moments, neither of us spoke. "I found Grandpa's journal," I said finally. "He wrote about us both." Evan's gaze remained fixed on the empty judge's bench. "What did he say?" "That we're stronger together than in opposition." A faint smile, genuine if fleeting, crossed his features. He always did believe in complementary strengths. He turned to me then, meeting my eyes directly. "I'm withdrawing the claims. All of them. The transfers, the debts. Everything goes back to the estate as he intended." The simple statement represented more than legal concession. It was acknowledgement, perhaps even the beginning of understanding. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded once, his expression uncharacteristically open. I won't pretend I fully agree with his decision, but it was his to make. A pause, heavy with unspoken history. "And you were his grandson, Danny, in every way that mattered to him." The words, so different from those he'd spoken in Grandpa's study weeks earlier, settled something within me, a question I hadn't realized still needed answering. After the hearing concluded, brief and procedural, the legal mechanism that formalized what had already been decided between brothers, we walked together down the courthouse steps, two men carrying the legacy of the grandfather who had shaped them both. "He left you a letter," I said as we reached the sidewalk. "In his desk it has your name on it." I hadn't opened it, respecting the private communication between Grandpa and his blood grandson. Evan paused, surprise evident in his expression. "I'll come by the house later to get it, if that's all right." I nodded, recognizing the tentative quality of this new equilibrium between us. Not quite reconciliation, not quite partnership, but perhaps the beginning of something that honored Grandpa's final wish for his grandsons. That evening, I sat on the porch of the Hayes family home, watching as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. In my hands was Grandpa's final letter to me, found alongside Evan's in the desk drawer. "Family isn't built by blood, Danny. It's built by choice, respect, and love. You've given me all three. Now the legacy is yours, not because of who you were born as, but because of who you became." I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my pocket as the last light faded from the sky. For the first time since Grandpa's passing, I didn't feel like the adopted son, the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong. I felt like the grandson he had always seen me to be, chosen deliberately, valued completely, exactly as I was. If you've been moved by this story of family, inheritance, and the power of genuine connection, please consider subscribing to my channel for more emotional narratives that explore the complexities of human relationships. Each week, I share stories that touch the heart while revealing deeper truths about what truly makes a family. Hit that subscribe button to join our storytelling community.